Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Baithak. My name is Kumar Anand, and I work with Center for Civil Society. Today's guest is Vipin Veetil. Vipin is a professor of economics at Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode, and Vipin has studied economics at Delhi University and George Mason University. Uh, George Mason University, you may know, is also the place where which was the economics department was set up by Jim Buchanan, and who is a Nobel laureate. He won the Nobel in 1986, and I think the department also has one more Nobel laureate in Vernon Smith, if I'm not wrong. So there are two Nobel laureates. Vipin works so far. Oh yes, most important part. Vipin works in on mostly macro-related questions and monetary economics, agent-based modeling, stuff like that. थोड़ा fancy sound करता है, थोड़ा सा मेरे तो ऊपर से जाता है. So, but as the topic of today's conversation and Baithak, as you know, is free trade and protectionism, and tariff is on everyone's mind. So it's quite ideal that we, today is 1st of August when we are recording this conversation. I don't know, are we going to stick with 25% or is going to something else? But definitely we need to thank Donald Trump to bring trade and protectionism back to the forefront of the conversation in ordinary people's mind. Otherwise, it's generally not always so. The common man is thinking about trade, especially international trade. Now suddenly everyone's mind, this topic is there. So first, welcome Vipin. And the first question to you to get started on is, what do you think is a good trade and tariff policy from India's point of view?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me over. I'm delighted to be here. Of course, Center for Civil Society is not is a little bit like coming back home after some years, and I do drop by every few years. So, Kumar, thank you so much for having me over. The question you asked, of course, is a very difficult question. What is the optimal trade policy? And it's a question that most in the press are not asking, right? There's a fair amount of conversation about whether it should be 20%, 25%, whether Indian tariffs on American goods should be 50% or 58%, or what is it? But really, fundamentally, what are the primitives or what are the fundamental forces that should tell us what optimal tariffs are, right? And I think a good place to begin is to kind of think about or try to understand why people trade. Okay, because ultimately it's not nations who trade, it's individuals who trade, firms trade, right? Nations are just statistical aggregates, right? And these aggregates do not have lives of their own, right? Statistical aggregates do not make decisions on what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce, right? These decisions are made by individuals, households, and firms, right? So indeed, the best place to get started is to try to understand why is it that individuals and firms and households trade, right? And indeed, if they had to create a policy, what kind of tariffs would they impose on themselves or each other? Okay. And the first thing to notice, of course, is presently I'm teaching a course at IIM Kozhikode called Economic Myths, right? And to my class, my MBA class, just 2 days ago, right? I'd asked, why do people trade? And these are not sort of, I mean, they've come through a very competitive exam into this institute. They're reasonably bright individuals, right? Some of them are lazy, but even the lazy ones are somewhat bright, right? And the predominant answer was people trade because of innate differences in advantages. That some people are better at doing one thing and other people are better at doing other thing, right? This is the theory of absolute advantage, right? If you're better at cooking and I'm better at giving economics lessons, then I would hire you as a cook and you would hire me as an economics professor. This is not required at all. If this were required, the nexus of trade, international trade, division of labor amongst human beings would be far smaller than what we have now. All that's required for trade, right, is the fact that you could be worse than me at doing everything, but you're not equally worse at everything. So you're a worse cook than me and you're a worse economist than me, but you're not equally worse at both. And that provides an opportunity to trade. Okay, right? So this is, of course, the idea of comparative advantage. And if there were one principle of economics that I would teach, and if I just had an hour or 2 hours or whatever, the one thing I would teach is the theory of comparative advantage at the level of individuals, right? So for instance, if my cook, right, if she's a worse cook than me and she's a worse economist than me, there is still a possibility and there is a reason for us to trade, for her to specialize in being a cook and for me to specialize in being an economist, despite the fact that I'm better at both. simply because the more time I spend doing economics, or the more time I spend doing cooking, the less time I have to spend doing economics. Okay. Another way to think about this is I either have the possibility of trading with myself, which is autarky, or I have the possibility of trading with another individual. And as long as the other individual is not equally bad at all things that we're interested in, right, there are advantages to trading. And this is what opens up this wide nexus of trade. And this is why United States, even if United States as a statistical aggregate is better than Nigeria at producing all goods and services, still benefits from trading with Nigerians. And again, not just Nigeria benefits from trading with the United States, Americans benefit from trading with Nigerians, even if the Nigerian economy is worse at doing all things, as long as it's not equally worse at all things, right? So this is what critically opens up the possibility of trade amongst nations, people who have very different skill sets, very different cultures, very different abilities, and so on and so forth.
It is so beneficial for everyone.
Yeah.
Where the tariff comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the sort of originary confusions which generates these tariffs is ultimately, in some sense, and I think this is what people like you, Parth, Souvik, of course, I see a photograph of Souvik, organizations like Center for Civil Society work with, which is ideas, right? Ultimately, of course, trade policy and all policies originate in some senses from ideas. All is won and lost in the battle of ideas. All is won and lost in the battle of ideas, right? So I think the confusion in terms of battle of ideas originates from seeing a nation as a firm. A nation as a firm. Okay? If you're a firm, of course whatever you pull in. So imagine a firm as this kind of some three-dimensional object which has some boundaries. Okay, I'm sure each of you has a different kind of, some of you have colorful firms and others have less colorful firms, and others have like translucent boundaries of the firm. Some people have people in the firm, whatever. So I'll let you fly with your imagination, right? Okay, but leave a little bit of space for other stuff and don't fill your brains with only firm, right? So you have firm and this entity. If you're a firm, it's a production entity, and it's very, very important for sustenance that the value of what you pull in, right, is lower than the value of what you push out. That difference, of course, is the profit that the firm makes. Okay, and that's the nature of production entities. A country is not a production entity. The value of what it pulls in, there is no reason for it to be less than the value of what it pushes out. A country is also not a consumption entity. It's mere statistical aggregate, right? If you're a household, right, from a utility point of view, the value of what you pull in should be more than the value of what you push out. Right? Otherwise, there's no point working. If indeed the goods I consume I value less, right, then the amount of time I have to spend working, then I'd probably not work and earn money. I'll just stay at home and enjoy leisure. Right? So from a consumption point of view, in some senses, we're all running balance of payments deficits, and we should. In a utility terms, the values of what we pull in must always be greater than the values of what we push out. The issue arises that from a production point of view, things are always the opposite. And if you start looking at a country as a firm, then you go down this rabbit hole where you start saying, if a firm has to make a profit, country has to make a profit. Now, how do I think of a country as making a profit? I arbitrarily, gather the statistical aggregates of things that are crossing the border of the country. But the border of the country is nothing like the border of the firm. The firm is a production unit and the firm has clear laid down objectives. A country doesn't have a single objective for a very simple reason, because there are many firms, many individuals. Firms are production entities, individuals and households are consumption entities. Each of them have their own objectives. So this whole issue arises, and you will see this in Trump's remarks. We are getting ripped off because there is this trade deficit, right? We are getting ripped off because it's balance of payments. He's confusing a country with a firm. This is what this is the origin of the issue with regards to Trump. And I think once you start doing that, then of course you do everything you can to make sure that the values of stuff that come in, right, are lower than the values of stuff that go out, because that's what production entities should do. So tariffs, non-tariff barriers, you go the whole route. Once that, yeah.
I like so Jim Buchanan, whom we talked about, kind of the co-founder of Public Choice Economics, and the basic one of the founding building blocks that he lays down is methodological individualism. And so any analysis requires the study of individuals. and unfortunately, most of the time, in public pronouncements of political leaders, they speak in aggregates. We think in aggregates. We think, okay, India versus China, trading with China. Okay, China is productive, India is not productive, etc. And those fallacies emanate from there. Competitive advantage, by the way, is a very critical element of what we do in our public policy workshops. We do through matter of activity. And I like the sentence which I think it from Sovic, I don't know, it might somewhere else. It says, do what you do best and trade for the rest. It's not Sovic, someone else. So, so do what you do best and trade for the rest. I don't know if kind of captures the essence of competitive advantage, but essentially it does capture the overall essence of how do you, why the trade exists and why all the prosperity over a period of time across borders, across for everyone, we have all become better off, but still kind of completely confounds me that we have continued to add barriers to it, and go down this route of creating sort of relative or less prosperity for all of us together. Right. So while you could have more prosperity and you are all choosing to have less prosperity. Yeah. So this is still confusing. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think I think this is one of those areas, and I'm glad we're doing this. It's one of those areas where it's very important to spend time thinking about principles and foundational principles before we jump into policy. There are major gains to be had from sort of getting some clarity in terms of principles. Right? So indeed, if erecting tariff barriers against another nation state is beneficial, what about tariff barriers within a nation state? Would a particular province or a region or a state or a district benefit if you erect tariff barriers? Yes or no, right? And you take the argument further. What about a single household? Right? Would a single household benefit by erecting tariff barriers? What about an individual? Would you benefit from not trading with other individuals? Now, there is no reason to have hypothetical experiments because this exists. There are households that live far away from everyone else. So, for instance, if you take a train from Kerala to Mumbai, or what used to be called Bombay, the name has changed. Of course, nothing else has changed about the city. It still has open sewers. Right, so whereas already the Indus Valley civilization had closed sewers, so this is an issue. Nonetheless, if you take the train from Kerala to Bombay, right, you will pass through areas where there are very few people, scantily populated, and the households and individuals living there are essentially living in a high tariff world. Right, the tariffs there or the obstacles to trade are not imposed by armed gunmen, but they're just imposed by nature or natural distances. It's very costly to go and trade with people in Bombay, right? So again, tariff barriers are no different from having the Sahara Desert to cross, or having a large sea to cross. It's exactly the same. There's no difference. It's just a question whether the obstacle is human-made or the obstacle is natural. Now, these individuals are essentially living in a high-tariff world, and if you look, they tend to be poor, much poorer than the people in Bombay or Delhi or cities nearby, right? So really, I think that's where you start kind of beginning to think about what does it do to people or groups of people when they're isolated and far away. And Michael Kramer, who got the Nobel Prize with Banerjee and Duflo, right, of the three, the one who deserved to get the prize, right? Michael Kramer has this fabulous paper, right, where he looked at human well-being, human living standards of human beings before sea routes were mastered. What that allowed him to do was he was able to look at different regions of the world which are largely isolated, right? So he looked at Tasmania, Australia, North America, and Eurasia. Now, and what he finds is that the lowest standards of living are in Tasmania with the fewest people, and the highest standards of living are in Eurasia, which has the highest number of people, right? And of course, Australia and North America for somewhere in between. And the reasons are relatively simple. More people. And of course, there are many reasons to trade, and this is another thing that we don't kind of speak about often. Like, why trade? Why trade? Or why is it good to interact and be with other human beings? And one reason, of course, there are many reasons. One reason is just ideas. The more people you have, the more likely that you're going to have an idea about a new vaccine, a better way to travel, a cheaper way to produce bread. And there's something very peculiar about ideas. right? Now this glass of water, right? As soon as I drink this water, like, right, there is less water left for you. Okay, water is a rival good. Okay, but an idea is not rival. If I come up with an idea of how to make a vaccine or how to make a glass at a lower cost, right, and I use it, doesn't mean there's less of the idea left for you. So the more people you have, the more ideas you have, right? And so again, you would find out isolationism, autarky doesn't really help. And we know this from international evidence. We know this from Michael Kramer's work, of course, but we know this from theory. And then it goes. The baffling thing is, why is it that tariffs seem to be so appealing, despite yeah.
Thank you for reminding me that I have coffee to drink, and less coffee for everyone else because I took a sip. Rivalrous, yeah. No, this is a common question that we get in our policy program, and common, whenever you have conversation, is that okay? People who live in Arunachal Pradesh or far-flung areas, are not well connected, and therefore government needs to come in and start intervening or start building big public projects. For example, why it doesn't matter the cost, because of course cost is not borne by any particular individual, and therefore why not have rail lines everywhere, road lines everywhere, airports everywhere, I mean, of course people don't take this to their logical conclusion, and think, okay, whatever basic necessities in your mind should be available to each and everyone, irrespective of where they are. So unfortunately, that won't be the case. One good so day before yesterday is when we kind of put together this Baithak.
No, we put it together 20 years ago when we decided to join economics. 22 years ago when we decided to join economics programs.
Yeah. And immediately when I went to the on YouTube, one of the first video that was kind of prompt, as part of prompt was given to me, was something to do with free trade somehow immediately. And of all things, there's a show in the I don't know where it is available now, but a lot of people know it, very popular, so-called The West Wing. And I think of all the comments ever, and I kind of liked reading comments on YouTube, my favorite pastime probably. One comment blew my mind, and the comment goes like this. It says, policy making is about solving the problem in front of you, and then spending years solving the problems your solution created. And it kind of, I thought, extremely succinctly put and kind of captures all the issues and one would think about. So one part that I realized, given all the conversation that is happening in popular media, the conversations are happening from the point of view of producers. They're talking, okay, what about agriculture farmers, production, who are producers of agriculture products? What about MSMEs? What about automobile manufacturers, etc.? I don't see many conversations happening from the point of view of consumers.
So again, this is something that Souvik sort of taught me when I was 20 or so. And I see Souvik's photographs. It's wonderful. What a handsome photograph. What a wonderful man, right? And it's been one of my great fortunes to have met him and spend some time with Souvik. And one of the things he taught me was, and you as well, and we were talking about this before this recording, is that the purpose of production is consumption, right? So all economic policy must be judged from the point of view of consumption, right? Because that is the end. Production is merely the means. Now, in economics, unlike in ethics, the end is everything, right? Now, and you can get to all kinds of strange places if you start mixing, some weighted average of, oh, the ends matter and the means matter, the ends matter and the means matter, right? Like, for instance, very easy to create employment, right? Take away, the ability of farmers to, take away plows from farmers and just hand them spoons, right? You just created lots of employment. You need a lot more farmers to dig. Take away the spoons, you created still more employment. Now they dig with their bare hands. You just need a lot more people, right? So again, you should really analyze all public policy from the point of view of consumption, not production. And coming to production, this again is a very peculiar thing. Like you pointed out, it seems the trade deal, again, it seems like one does not know, and very difficult to get kind of information on what went on behind the doors. But from what the press is reporting, it seems that the trade deal has fallen apart because of Indian government's decision not to reduce tariffs on agricultural commodities. Now, if you look at the empirically, if you look at the tariffs imposed on agricultural commodities, it's sizable. It's anywhere between 30% to some commodities going up to 70 or 80%, right? And again, the context that you give, right? There is now a fair amount of talk that we will, and again, it's not clear, why we should do this, but we will defend the medium and small scale enterprise, as if there is something good fundamentally about being a medium or a small scale enterprise. So I think it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time talking about the production side of things. The first thing is, it doesn't matter whether agriculture or non-agriculture, there's nothing good about being a medium or a small scale enterprise. There's nothing bad about being a medium or small scale enterprise. In the American economy, right, there are 6 million firms. Okay, 6 million firms. Okay, one firm has 1 million employees. Walmart. There are 1 million firms with 1 employee. There are 6 million firms with employees, right? Okay. Other than this, there are 25 million sole proprietorships. And there's a whole distribution of firms of different sizes in between. In fact, if you plot the number of firms, right, on the on one axis, right, and if you plot the size of firms on the other, and you log those both scales, you get a straight line. Now, of course, it's not very clear why a log should produce this kind of a relationship. Nonetheless, that's not the point of conversation today. The point being that this economy has firms of varied sizes. Now, do we know what the optimal size distribution of firms is? Not really. There are some advantage. Some sectors we know. For instance, if you go to saloons or barbers, these firms tend to have very few people. And again, there are good reasons why these firms tend to have very few people, right? One reason is that once you have management and hierarchy, it becomes very difficult to take information from individuals and pass it on to the person up above who's going to make a decision. Okay, right? So if you tell your the lady at the saloon that I want my hair done this way, whatever, and she has to pass that information to somebody who has to pass it to somebody. By the time the management gets it, it's all so convoluted that the management doesn't have the decision. It doesn't have kind of good information to decide. So in some industries, firm sizes are small just because of the nature of the product. Some industries, firm size tend to be big. But on the a priori, it's very difficult to say what firm size should be. This is something that evolves with technology and things like this. So again, in the Indian economy, there's nothing good about having lots of small firms. There's nothing bad about having lots of small firms. Now, one of the very problematic things about having lots of small firms, particularly sole proprietorships. Again, this is something that you and I were talking about yesterday. Sole proprietorships, the issue is that the sole proprietor bears the risk of production. And typically, the poor do not want to bear the risk of production. This is why your Shah Rukh Khan would buy an IPL team or whatever, right? And a struggling actor in Bombay will not. Struggling actor in Bombay will not even buy a share of the IPL team, because poor people do not want to bear risk. Ideally, they want the risk to be borne by richer individuals, right? Okay. But in India, we've created a situation where we've forced the poorest people in the country to bear the risk of production. And then, because it's not working out for them, we force the rest of the people to subsidize them bearing the risk of production. This is terribly silly. So really, we need a phenomenal change in our industrial organization, right? So at some point you said, it's good that Trump has brought all these issues. I think he's brought lots of issues to the surface, right? So, yeah.
Still, I was reading an op-ed and kind of list down different kinds of tariff, number that there is an agreement, and bringing a little bit geopolitics into it, you realize some of the other countries are getting numbers like, okay, UK, all from the US point of view, is of course 10, Vietnam is 20, Indonesia is 19, Japan 15, EU also 15, and India might end up with 25 or 26 or whatever the number is. It could be up or down. I think it is not settled yet, still under some process of negotiation. And generally, you'd assume that in trade, deals are win-win. Two parties, voluntary exchange, classic double thank you moments, win-win. And the current nature of negotiations, etc., is leading towards the fact that no matter what, but it's not going to be a win-win deal. So anyone who walks away from a deal with Donald Trump has to be the loser, and everyone needs to know that he's a loser.
Well, first of all, I don't think one needs to deal with this man at all, right? I don't think there is any need to spend time, money, or energy to send anybody to the US to negotiate with this man, right? Our trade policies, we know what our best trade policies are. It's unilateral free trade, reduce tariffs on all goods and services to zero with immediate effect. This is what Souvik would have said, and I like to repeat. The only thing I have to say with regards to this win-win thing, this is and we immediately win. And the American consumers also win if we reduce our, the American producers win, and because they're creating more value in their economy, there is more value, so consumers win in the US. Indian consumers win with again, agricultural commodities. One of the more beautiful things about this is that if you look at expenditure patterns, the poor spend a far greater share of their income on food and agricultural commodities than the rich. The rich are buying yachts, right? Dal chawal doesn't, make up 50% of Mukesh Ambani's, daily expenditures, but it does for lots of poor. So if prices of agricultural commodities drop, right, the poor benefit. Of course, the issue is that there are lots of people in the agriculture sector who are producing these things. Their profit margins might go, but then we need an economy where there are opportunities for them to get into other sectors, right? And there is an issue the big issue here is also the fact that, but before I get into the big issue, so it is a win-win in the longer scheme of things, but in the short run, there are losers. And that's what stems this whole process, because the producers of these commodities in India or Vietnam or wherever else, in the short run lose. And the question is, how do we create a situation where their losses in the short run are limited and they have the possibility of transitioning into other sectors? And that is not something that we think about all that much, because again, we cannot shoot people, right? I guess you possibly could, I guess we don't, right? But without coercion, right? If you need these individuals to, there has to be ways for them to get out. Part of it cannot be done by New Delhi. Again, this is very strange, because now when you think about tariff negotiations, you think about Delhi being the center of the story. Cannot be done with Delhi, right? The whole set of reforms, beginning from Narasimha Rao, Rajiv Gandhi wanted to do a little bit, but beginning from Narasimha Rao all the way to the present government, right? Delhi, Delhi, Delhi. But if you look at agriculture and education and many of the other sectors, right? These are sectors where states should respond. And states seem to do the exact opposite. Delhi has to, in fact, twist their arms to get any reforms going on. If you want, people to get out of agriculture sector has to be more productive. You have to grow more on some pieces of land. So land parcels have to come together. You need organizations that have knowledge and capital to run this stuff. If they have to come in, they have to buy large amounts of agricultural land. All of this is pretty much illegal. Of course, some places there's bit legality here, bit of legality there, but by and large, right, the regulatory burden is way too high. So unless we kind of create a more dynamic economy for the agriculture sector, the issue is that the win-win in the long run gets stemmed by the fact that in the short run, there are winners and there are losers, and the losers just don't see a way out.
Yeah, I think that's the crucial problem. And I keep quoting this incident that a friend of mine asked Montek Singh Ahluwalia when he was the Planning Commission Vice Chairman. Varun. So he asked this question about, okay, ye karna hai. And it's one of those conferences when after, you're having tea, the question gets asked. And then you realize all the set of reforms and deregulation, cutting red tape, etc. that is required is known to everyone. Is known to all bureaucrats, is known to all politicians. To a large extent, sometimes probably it's known to definitely to all policymakers and think tank walas, and even to a large extent common man. But hota nahi hai. So the flippant reply that Montek Singh Ahluwalia gave to our friend was, ये सब पता है मेरे को, बताओ ये होगा कैसे, ठीक है? So the same question applies to you. And I think there's some insights that one can try and find, and we're talking a lot about fundamentals, is maybe lies in public choice theory. And to start looking at, okay, there are certain interest groups who will come together, who have higher, reasons to come together, while others, because of free rider problem or multiple other reasons, will not kind of come together to demand certain, ideas. So
I think, I think Center for Civil Society is a thought leader in this thing as well. One of the things they did with the education program some years ago was to create an association of budget private schools. Yeah, which was, I think, a fabulous idea. I've not seen that anywhere before. Perhaps it's there, but in India, I think it was certainly new. It's fabulous. When the farmers from, when some farmers from Punjab, again, it's important to say not all farmers, some farmers from Punjab decide to march on to Delhi. Can we have, consumers of wheat and so on march on to Delhi from another side? I mean, Delhi would hate this, right? Because then there are like 2 marches coming, etc., right? But the point is, can you make an association of, consumers of wheat or poor? Is there some way to get the message around? Now, at this point, the reason why the budget private school thing was still possible is the people who run the budget private schools knew that the regulatory burden is hurting them, right? In the case of food and international trade, many of those who are hurt are entirely oblivious to it. For instance, this is very strange. When a small group of farmers decide to, and they were a small group of farmers, by the way, they were violent, but they were a small group. They could have been dealt with in other ways, but they were a small group, right? Yeah, right. They could have been dealt with in other ways.
Not reaching violence.
Well, no. What they did was very violent. You don't march onto the state national capital and threaten the very stability of this nation state. This is very serious. They're extremely serious. It's marching on to Patna or Trivandrum is very different from marching on to Delhi. This is threatening the very stability of this nation state, right? So, anyways, that apart. But long story short, when the farmers were marching on to Delhi for this agricultural reform bill, and again, if we had gotten the agricultural reform bill in then, we would have been in a much better situation today, because the ability for the Indian economy to transition farmers from agriculture to other parts of the economy would be much better, and we would have been much closer to the win-win thing you have in mind. The losers would not have stemmed this process. Tariffs could have been brought down, and this whole, Donald Trump imposing tariffs on Indian goods would not have arisen. Agriculture would not have been a sore point. But the point I wish to make is that when the farmers were marching on to Delhi, in Kerala, there were people marching in support of the farmers. Now, this is very strange, because these are the very individuals who are subsidizing the farmers in Punjab. They are losing, and yet they are marching, saying that we would like to continue paying for this, partly because they are entirely oblivious and ignorant. So I think if you want to replicate what CCS did in terms of creating an interest group which represents the public good, right? There is an intermediate step of educating these people that here is where your interests belong. So there is kind of an additional step to do, and again, it's a battle of ideas.
Yeah, I think the analogy does not quite follow there, because National Independent School Alliance, I'm a big fan, is an interest group of, again, the producers of education, not the consumers. The consumers would be parents and students, who generally you would find the free ride problem still applies, would have extremely little interest to come together and form a coalition, while in case of NISA, budget private schools, have strong skin in the game, strong reason to come together, demand certain. Of course, those regulations are hurting them, and if you remove those regulations, the competition will go up, quality will improve, the price will come down, just like any other industry. So again, it was easier to get the NISA thing done, but just like in consumers, you won't get a union of students or parents. You don't get a union of agriculture produced consumers.
Consumers of wheat and rice. Like, how do you get a group? I'm sure there is some intelligent. I mean, if there is a way to put human beings on the moon, I'm sure there is some way we can figure out how to create.
You figure it out, you will have the Nobel Prize. I mean,
or I'll win an election, more likely.
You win an election, yes, that will be the. So I think in India, the biggest union is that of railway workmen. Probably, union membership is in hundreds of thousands of people, or maybe more. I don't think it's bankers union, but definitely railway workmen would be one of the biggest union. So yeah, the biggest union will be replaced by 1.4 billion, consumers, if you have that.
You have the whole idea of having a union of all taxpayers in India.
Yeah, I mean, those are ideas generally. So all taxpayers, consumers, and voters. But you never see those union. So I think that sets up a good foundation on which we can kind of open the floor for questions. Again, just like what you get in newspaper or television debates, the more conversation there happening is about, could be the rhetoric part of it, or could be, who said what, two big, powerful men trying to beat the chest and kind of win or showcase their stature. No one willing to back down. I see multiple of cartoons where Donald Trump and Narendra Modi are portrayed in a particular manner.
They are hugging each other.
These years. So and the conversation so far is little trying to build on the essential elements of those. And with that, I would like to open if there are queries, questions from the audience. Yes.
Two questions. One is, the thing which stood out for me so far is, firstly, you have spoken how trade essentially happens between trading partners, and trade idea stems from the preferences of firms, and countries don't have ultimate objectives when it comes to international trade between countries. But then how do we justify mechanisms like special and differential treatment, in which LDCs, that is least developed countries or developing countries, are allowed to have certain leeway when it comes to international trade, in the form of increasing their custom duties or raising non-tariff barriers. So how do we justify that in this context?
Yeah, so I think, the way to get started in terms of thinking of these things, right, is with the simplest possible model. One of the issues, of course, is the country is a complex and large unit, right? So in India, you probably have about on the order of about 50 million firms, right, perhaps more, and you have a much larger kind of you have a population of 1.2 billion. So I would imagine about 300-400 million workers. That's what I would imagine, like active workers, right? That's a very large, and them living in different geographically spaced out regions. This is a very complex system to understand. Then if you're thinking about that system trading with another system, that the other system is also complex. It's a lot to think through. The simplest way to get started would be something, and think about that little village somewhere in Maharashtra that you see on your train ride from Kerala to Bombay, right? Of course, I'm in Delhi, so I can continue saying Bombay and still get through the airport without getting beaten, right? So that's why I like coming to Delhi, right? Okay. So again, if you look at one of those villages, and in some cases it just has few households, and you ask them, what is the optimal policy you want? Here is one policy we can give you. You can send whatever you want to Bombay, okay? But whenever Bombay sends you something, we'll create an obstacle, okay? The obstacle, of course, could be in the form of, we're going to charge you a higher price when it comes into your village, right? Which is equivalent to whenever Bombay sends you something, we'll take some bit out of it and throw it away, okay? And we are doing this for your development. You're actually, your village or your, which is basically, let's say 3 households or 5 households or whatever, you're actually going to get richer, because every time Bombay sends you something, we're going to make sure not all of it reaches you. But whenever you send stuff to Bombay, it can go. And what do you think they'd say to you? They'd say, don't do this. What we want is, we want to send as much as possible to Bombay, and we want to receive as much as possible from Bombay with the least amount of obstacle. Think about it similarly, like you say, I'm going to build a road, right? But here is the trick, right? I'm going to build a road where you can only send stuff to Bombay and not get anything from Bombay. And that's going to help you, because what you need is exports to grow. And taking stuff from Bombay is very bad. Why? Because you are so poor and you cannot compete with the companies in Bombay. So as soon as their goods come in, you won't be able to produce anything. Do you think they'd agree to that? And forget that. I mean, if you want to make it even simpler, think about you as an individual living somewhere. Would you agree to that? You would not. That's the last thing you want. Of course, you understand there are people in Bombay who are much higher skilled, who can do things that you cannot do. And that's precisely why you want to trade with them both ways, right? Do you know anyone who's, this never happens. I know nothing. So I'm going to go into a cave, not trade with anybody. And from the cave, I get out after 10 years. And I have all these skills and I beat everybody. Never happens. Of course, with Buddhist monks, right? But that's a different ball game. Okay? And by the way, they too, before they go into the cave, spend a lot of time in the group learning how to meditate. Okay? But again, so it doesn't make sense for the individual. It doesn't make sense for small groups, right? And of course, again, Kumar earlier was pointing out, large groups. It's often possible, not often, sometimes possible, that there are things which are true in larger scales, which is not true at smaller scales. It's absolutely true.
On the behalf of their domestic industries, that like we need more tariffs in some industries, and as compared to the others, and that is how we have mechanisms like safeguard duties, anti-dumping duties, and that mechanism is there in place. So
right, again, dumping is think about what dumping is. Dumping is just somebody selling something to you at lower than cost of production. Now for us, why do we at all care about the cost of production? From our point of view, the only thing we ought to care about is the cost at which it's sold to us. And the lower the cost, the better. Think about the following. Suppose you had fabulous monsoons and the cost of, certain production of certain, agricultural commodities went down. Would you complain? Right? Or let me actually I was talking to my class the other day. I said, suppose farmers will complain, of course, right? The consumers wouldn't. Suppose you're Japanese and we live in Japan. Okay, there's fabulous salmon, off the island of Japan, and there's an industry, fishing industry, lots of resources go into, getting salmon, right? Now suppose, and again, this is identical to the dumping issue, which is why I mentioned this, right? There are no differences, right? And suppose for some reason the salmons just decide that you don't need to catch us anymore. We're going to fly and unskin ourselves and split and appear on your sushi table. This is what we're going to do. The salmon union decides that we're just going to be fabulously cooperative with human beings who want to consume us. Okay? Should the Japanese be really worried about this and put up a tariff? No. Of course, the old issue that Kumar pointed out goes to that it's not a win-win situation. There are losers. It's the people in the Japanese fishing industry. Now, is it, and not just humans, only humans, but also the capital that's involved. Is there a way to find the human beings and the capital into other industries? Well, now that depends on how flexible this economy is. How do price systems work? Is it easy to start new organizations? Is it easy to close old organizations? Closing also means that you must be able to sell assets. Are there markets in which you can sell these assets and move? Right? And in some scenarios, and again, I don't know if Kumar agrees, in some scenarios, certain amount of, government unemployment benefits can be useful to make these transitions happen, depending, of course, on the state capacity. This is not something I would recommend in India because most states don't have state capacity, right? In Bombay, you say something on the way to the airport, you get beaten, right? There are people marching onto the state capital and nothing happens. So Indian state needs to develop more capacity in just doing basic stuff. But in more advanced states, right, a little bit of unemployment benefit can sometimes also help transition, but as a supplement to vibrant markets where these things happen. Nonetheless, the point is that anything that comes at lower cost is identical to it coming to us at lower cost because of natural reasons, weather, whatever else. There is no difference, right? There is, of course, one small difference. And again, these people get bothered. What if they're going to dump this to destroy our industry and then they raise the prices? Now, this is a question of risk. And question of risks arise even again with natural causes. What if good monsoons are just good monsoons right now and next year the monsoons are bad again, right? And how do we deal with risk? The best people to deal with risks are the individuals who are going to make profits from taking care of these risks. So there are people, individuals who would maintain go downs of wheat because they know at some point monsoons go bad. They would look at statistical relations of how well do these monsoons do. They would maintain buffer stocks and so on and so forth. Why? Because they would make profits out of this. And they would make sure that they sell it at the right moment to get profits, even out these what would have been other fluctuations in prices. Similarly, if another country tries to dump and destroy this industry, it's not, if the government is aware of it, private business is also aware of it, and they have far greater incentive to act upon it. So what would they do? If our assessment of risk is such that the Chinese are going to dump for 3 years, private industry would be like, let's enjoy all this for 3 years, but we stay prepared. And by we, I don't mean collectively prepared in terms of government policy. Private industry would stay prepared because they know they can benefit from providing these goods and services as soon as the Chinese stop dumping. So let's just get all the goods. The less we work, the better.
I mean, that part is, for those 3 years, the producers will not be that happy. Yeah. The consumers will be very happy. Yeah. But again, the point that you raised earlier is very critical, is your ability to quickly, how flexible the markets are, entry barriers, exit barriers, how easy to close a particular company is. Saurabh and I have lived in Bombay, and there are parts in South Bombay where you pass through. There are companies which have been, shut for last 30, 40, 50 years, but have still not been, gone through the entire bankruptcy process. So the amount of time that it takes, so that's where, Shavi, you need to kind of work on as, your legal law hat. How do you resolve it faster?
Our issue is not Trump. Our issue is exactly this. I was visiting Kumar in Bombay, and he took me around. There was this large factories where nothing was happening, and I asked Kumar, and he explained to me that back then, remember this, the same thing, that these assets are under judicial dispute. Since when? Since the cotton manufacturing industry collapsed in Bombay. This is decades ago, right? And the cases are in court. The courts are clogged. You cannot have assets which don't move through markets and find alternate uses. This is our issue, that the markets and our institutions are not creating sufficiently flexible markets for the rapid allocation of resources, right? That's the issue. Trump is not an issue. Trump is an issue, but he's a problem for lots of people, Americans. But yeah. So
I like the part where so Donald Trump is an uncertainty, and that uncertainty we have no control over. But there is an uncertainty that we can have control over, which is in our own making. So, and the component of uncertainty that we have made ourselves is quite substantial. And if you remove that, your ability to trade internationally and ability to be competitive in the national market goes up. Just one small point before I forget about your integration of Indian economy to the rest of the world. This is many years ago, and I remember a conversation which someone was having probably with Vipin's professor, at George Mason, Larry White. After 2008 financial crisis, the conversation was that India was very, very celebrating big time that, okay, we have come out of this financial crisis relatively unscathed, and then I think Larry in his typical style answers, well, if you live in cave, you will, not be hurt about that at all, so the general point about cave, so yes, short term costs are there, but long term gains are much more. So any of this cannot be a reason for you to, like kind of walk away or not be plugged into the world economy. The idea is how do you reduce the cost, and my general submission will be that a lot of it is in our hands, but we have purposefully made it a little expensive.
And again, if we go all the way and try to create a flexible economy where land, capital, human beings can move about, and after that we notice that somehow certain policy changes are causing great stress to certain individuals. Are there things that the state can do? And again, this is somewhere I tend to a little bit disagree with libertarians sometimes. I think there are things that the state can do, but again, it depends on the state capacity. Is the state able to do basic things like law and order already? There are things that the state can do, but we are far from that question. We have created fair number of hurdles for ourselves. We need to, Trump is, again, it's irrelevant by and large for our problems. Entirely, by the way, this would hurt him a lot. He doesn't like to be irrelevant, right? But it's true. And for our problems, he's entirely irrelevant. We don't need to go there. We don't need to hug him, right? We should kind of figure out what our issues are here at home, right?
Now, once the mobile has fallen, it is days made. It has to happen once a day. Okay.
You partially answered it in your this answer, but I will still like to put it for better clarity. So you said there are high tariffs in agriculture. I mean, India has put very high tariffs on agriculture that are very distinct, and you quote that this is because of protecting farmers or protecting MSMEs, basically to protect our domestic production. But I think there is more to that. I think we put high tariffs because in order to counter the high amount of subsidies that are already there with our trading partners, for example EU and US. And I would like to know about how you think about the situation when we talk about flexibility, but at the other end of it our trading partner is playing a protectionist role for that matter.
Well, that's lovely. I can't be in a better situation. The French want to tax their citizens to give us, low cost cheese. I would encourage them to go further. Just give us zero price cheese. For me, that's no different from our cows deciding that you don't need to feed us anymore. We're just going to give you milk for free, right? And not only that, the birds are going to come in, and this is going to be some kind of an animation, imaginary kind of society where cheese just gets made for free. I'd love that. And same thing with the Americans and all of that. Now, but we do have an issue. In the short run, the shock is large. And this is the win-win situation. Because we've created this kind of a very inefficient agricultural sector, protected from international trade, but also protected from Indians who could produce these goods at lower cost. Who are these Indians? We do not know, because they are not allowed to create organizations, acquire land and capital and produce these things. It's an uncompetitive sector. By definition, you are not really allowed to compete in the agriculture sector. It's by and large driven by sole proprietors, and there's some glorification of sole proprietorship. That's a bad idea. Most modern technology and advancements doesn't come from individuals who kind of operate by themselves. It comes from organizations that invest in research and developments over long periods of time. Okay, so we need large organizations to get into this sector. Nonetheless, there will be a major shock, because you've got this highly inefficient sector on which lots of people depend, and suddenly it's not required. And on top of that, you have an economy which has very little flexibility in terms of labor, capital moving out to other uses. Delhi cannot decide, because land, you still have, most states will not allow for sale of agricultural land for non-agricultural uses, right? So this is a terrifying situation in many circumstances. But the terrifying situation arises not because of the fact that the French are willing to give us cheese for lower cost, for lower prices than the cost of production, but because we've created a situation where land, labor, and individuals cannot move from one place. That's what we need to sort out. And once we sort that out, we should encourage the Americans and the French to be silly. And the fact that Chinese have devalued their currency is wonderful. For us, it's terrible for the Chinese. Well, for us, it's wonderful. The Chinese Communist Party is basically selling slave labor to the rest of the world by devaluing the yuan. Because every time some individual works in China, right, he has to work he has to work harder or longer hours to buy American goods. And for Americans, it's cheaper because Chinese government has devalued the yuan. And the same is true for us. We should encourage the Chinese Communist Party to keep doing this. They're selling Chinese labor, slave labor to the rest of the world. If I were in China, I would protest about this, but probably not, because I'll get killed if I do that. But, I guess, but again, our issues are our issues. Trump is entirely irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, FYI, we are not condoning slave labor. And second part, just to add to what Vipin was saying, we have one individual on the wall, Sarat Joshi, and his extensive work kind of showcases that every input that comes into agriculture is heavily regulated. The output is heavily regulated, the prices are administered. There is no industry in India which is as regulated as agriculture. So, yes, you're right. Some parts of some country is subsidizing and therefore trying to make an uncompetitive market. But we have made, we are hurting ourselves way, way, way more than anyone else can hurt us. And you dig deeper into it, you'll realize much of it is our own making rather than anyone else's. Okay. Yes, Saurav, I saw first, and then Chetna.
I think two things struck out to me. One was that this is a negative sum game also for Americans. So Americans are losing as much as Indians are losing. The second thing is, thanks for bringing up public choice. So I'm curious to know, what are the interest groups that are provocating the American government to go all out to find these sanctions across, go shopping, and what are their incentives? And if there is a way to find out, I have another question, but I'll pause till I get a view.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't know about what interest groups are mine. I think, I think Vipin mentioned it once during his talk earlier that a particular politician goes around in an election campaign asking that, we are being ripped off, in this case, Donald Trump, and so maybe I would assume to a large extent this entire group of people is his own making in his mind, probably, and not something that real exists. There could be real, but I am not very, very glued into America's political economy or what's happening, what interest groups are there. So I wouldn't know for sure. You have a second question?
I wouldn't know either. I wouldn't know either. It seems to me that he ran companies for a long time. He certainly seems to think of a country as a company. That's certainly an ideas issue. But in terms of the very important question you ask about interest groups, it must be there. And Saurabh, you're absolutely right, because the losses for the average American consumer are so large. The losses for many American industries are so large because the cost of construction has gone up because there are steel tariffs, that it cannot be that unless there are interest groups, balancing this off, that this can be pursued. But who they are, I just am not tuned into that.
So on Twitter, a little bit that I see people conversing about from the American point of view, because a lot of people that I follow are academicians in the US, and what they are talking about is one big hope that Trump walking away from this particular kind of nihilistic, almost kind of policy, is that the increase in cost on American consumers is going to be significant enough that there will be a blowback and pressure on him, probably even by midterm elections or whatever it is, and thereby, there will be a reversal of this.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that it's Trump, right? It's not Americans in general. They're wonderful people. It's a beautiful country, right? They're a very free country. They have actually supplied most consumer goods and most, contributed to tremendous amounts of innovation and human well-being over the last 200 years. This economy has chugged along at 2% per year for so long, taken in people from around the world. So what we are seeing in the last few years with Trump and so on, hopefully is an aberration. Hopefully it'll go away, and we'll see the lighter day. Hopefully, but again, that's not going to help solve our issues. So, but sort of, I don't know. It's a very good question.
Pose one more. So last time when Trump announced, I think it was called a freedom bill, when there were outright tariffs, there was this narrative that the financial markets had a way to discipline Trump. So the bond market reacted, and that provoked him to unroll it. So I wonder, how is the bond market reaction here? Are there counterbalancing forces which are already in play, which has some kind of impact in these announcements?
Again, I'm not most up to date on those numbers, but I assume just on principle basis that there would be some countervailing forces. If you keep pushing and the costs are borne by someone, then there would be some adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, again, because answering your question requires, these are again very good questions, right? Because his campaign was financed, right? He's not alone. There is a Republican Party. The party will also need next set of election campaigns to be financed. So if they're going to hurt some of their own financiers a lot, then they may not fund next round of elections. So all the questions you ask are very pertinent. I just don't have any answers. Yeah.
Me neither. But one small point, we should know that Trump is not going to be running for re-election. So in some case, he could just be, like just blow up the world. Let's see. It reminds me of Joker from The Dark Knight. Some people just likes to see the world burn. I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty sure he's not like that. But the policies seem to be towards that direction.
But some of what he says is true. The fact that not just India, many other countries have these high barriers which are not letting in American goods or other international goods. That's absolutely true. There's nothing false about it. It's empirically true, right? So but of course, what he does from there is a bit,
Yeah. So 4 industries where India has extreme high tariffs: agriculture, steel, aluminum, etc., and automobiles. This reminds me of a monograph that Souvik wrote many years ago called Four Wheels for All. And his broader point was that our tariff on automobiles is more than 100%, probably 150%. Even with all the reforms, those have not gone away. And was comparing in some African countries how middle class people there are driving second and third hand BMWs, and the kind of cars that we are stuck with are extremely of poor quality, very, very high taxes. So you remove those barriers and, but yeah, so therefore.
Some of the stuff, absolutely, some of the stuff Trump is saying, when I was a graduate student in the US, my roommate had a Jeep Wrangler. Now, he had a Jeep Wrangler which was second hand, I think 6 years or 5 years used, which cost him, I think back then about $4,000. That's the price of an auto rickshaw here, which some foreigners call tuk-tuk or whatever else, right? It sounds tuk-tuk, tuk-tuk. Auto rickshaw is 3 times as much. 3 times, you see, okay. So basically you can get, and shipping through the sea is basically zero cost, right? So if you have a large ship, you can fill it with Jeep Wranglers, ship it from the US and run it as auto rickshaws here. More people can sit in, right? Better for the environment, more comfortable, right? So your spine doesn't break. Lots of auto rickshaw drivers have spinal injuries, okay? Right? Again, so lots of stuff that Trump says, there is a great deal of truth to it. Of course, the way he says it and so on, and announcing international policy on Truth Social may not be kind of very stately, but if you leave that aside, right, there is some truth with, right? It's not entirely kind of fable of his mind, right?
Yeah. So, especially with regards to India, some of the things that he had said was spot on. And except when we make a case, it's generally from Indian producer's point of view and not from Indian consumers' point of view, who will have a completely different story to tell. In which case, they will stand with Trump rather than anyone else. Yeah. Chetna, yes.
I have somewhat of a rudimentary question, which is that right now we've established that there is nothing to be gained from a protectionist culture or tariffs, and so who stands to benefit from this since it continues to exist so prevalently here in the West everywhere? So is it just the appeal of the protection, not knowing that there is a safety net, or people are just genuinely unaware of it, or is there something else that is above both of these and some other third party is gaining from such a mess of policies?
I think it's a very, very good question, right? And there are many levels at which your question can be answered, right? So I don't know if you've already had the chance to read this wonderful article by Bruce Yandel called Bootleggers and Baptists, right? And Bruce Yandel looks at the Prohibition era in the United States, and he says, how do regulations come about? And he says, for a regulation to come about, and this is I think also true of deregulation, right? Either way, is that you need bootleggers and Baptists. You need people who are going to sell the idea. So in the US, for instance, when they want to prohibit drinking of alcohol, right? There were some people interested in doing this so that they could sell alcohol in the illegal markets, in the black markets, because you could make money off it. And you can't do that if it's not there's no prohibition. But you can't say that to the general public. Right? You can't say that there is a small group of people who want to make money off of this, the mafia, blah, blah, blah. But the Baptists would give, are the face of this. They'd say, don't drink for religious reasons. And and I'm going to make sure there is this law which prohibits drinking. So most regulations come about because the Baptists are in the front and there are bootleggers to bankroll this stuff at the back. And most deregulation happens again for the same reason. So going back to the earlier question, another way to deregulate is to find the bootleggers and Baptists who would help the deregulation happen. Going back to your question, so mostly in these tariff kind of scenarios, there are bootleggers and there are Baptists. There are people who benefit from imposition of tariffs, protections of various kind, right? But there are Baptists as well. There are professors, faculty members, economic journalists, right? People like you and me who talk about ideas, who come to such events, right? Who actually believe in certain ideas, and we become the face of it. Of course, the people who get advantage, and of course, some of us might believe in protection is good, but there are also bootleggers at the back who are going to benefit from this. And it's when these two forces come together that you get, regulations come up, right? And it's again, to deregulate, you need to get these two forces. There have to be some people who benefit from deregulation, but there also have to be Baptists who go out and kind of talk about why deregulation is good. And when these two forces come together, you get deregulation, right? But there is also a kind of more fundamental thing to your question, and I think this word that you mentioned, risk. I think, in general, we don't like risk, human beings. And that's why you see in most markets, risk is priced. We're willing to pay a premium to not have risk. And most of our evolution, our cognitive structure, evolves in smaller tribal settings, right? Where group sizes are roughly the number of people in this room or twice or thrice as much. So we're talking about, several dozen people living together. And we would do a lot to make sure that our tribe is not hit by a risk, okay? In that scenario, a small event could lead to the end of this tribe. In that scenario also, the death of few people could lead to a sizable drop in our living standards. Who knows? These may be the individuals who are the best at hunting or whatever else. Okay? So risk is scary, right? And I think that's something we carry in our minds even today, although we live in a large, complex market economy. So I think in terms of saleability of ideas, right, protectionism is much more saleable because it gives a sense of safety, some steadiness, some sense of stability, right? Saying that this flux where people can move from one industry to the other and they would find jobs in another industry seems too far-fetched in some senses for our brains, which have developed in an entirely different environment, right? So to understand how the functioning of a modern market economy and how it's very different from a small tribal economy, right, and how the forces at work are different is not trivial at all. So I think you rightly kind of caught on to this thing. There are more fundamental, possibly cognitive forces at work. So in that sense, it's not very clear humanity would ever be able to, or it's not clear what it would take to get us out of that cognitive trap, in some senses, right? Trade is strange in many ways. We interact with people with whom we don't share religious identities. We might hate many of their beliefs, and it benefits both of us. That's very strange. Typically in our day-to-day interaction, at least in our smaller societies, the people we benefit from are people we share identities with, right? And now here is a scenario where groups who are far away from each other in many ways and very different from each other benefit from interacting with each other. So if you go read ancient Greek writers on trade, some worry about this. They said one of the terrible things about trade is these ships come in with people who have other beliefs and habits, and they're going to corrupt our society, right? And indeed, to get away from these kind of tribal beliefs is not trivial at all, because our brains have evolved for so many years in a very different setting.
In some way, I was just thinking out loud. I think proper functioning of the role of what is the role of the state in society can be kind of described as two things, which is one is to take care of the risk, which is law and order, police, criminal justice system and national defense, all of that comes in. And second is reducing transaction costs. So if you put them two of those things together and you realize beyond that, the role of the state is not much, and that kind of takes care of it.
We are losing on all ends. I mean, people like you in the academia, you've probably studied more, but there is a widespread dissemination of such information wherein we compare. So, tariffs and protectionism, at least as far as I know, is a result of the world wars, especially the second one. How is it not obvious to everybody that we are losing on an international front? Why isn't that more on the forefront?
So tariffs and I mean, if you leave aside the question of tariffs, protectionism is not. It doesn't originate from World War II. In fact, it doesn't even originate from 300 years ago when Adam Smith was trying to fight mercantilist protectionism. These ideas go, and as I was saying, this idea, the earliest writing on protectionist thinking goes back to the Greeks, right? And there is a kind of look. First of all, there's a looking down upon trade per se, right? And not all Greeks, some, Plato included, right? There's a kind of that trade is something that should be left to the slaves. It's not an honorable profession to enter into. This is why Derrida McCloskey has this fabulous book called The Bourgeois Ethics, right, where she says the big change in Europe happens because kind of the way you view trade changes. It becomes an honorable activity, right? Now, I don't know if you agree with that thesis or not, but it's a good book to read. Nonetheless, going back to the Greeks, right? They already had sort of, some of them looked down upon domestic trade. International trade in many cases was looked down upon for additional reasons, which I mentioned earlier, that there are these individuals who come bringing other cultures, right? And which is potentially destabilizing our society. You do have some writers who say, even Thomas Aquinas, for instance, right? This is much later, of course, 13th and 14th century, right? Thomas, and I could be wrong by a little bit, but I think it's the 13th century. Right? Thomas Aquinas, he says that certain kinds of trade for goods that are absolutely necessary is okay within certain bounds, right? So the whole idea of let's just trade with everybody, that is indeed very new. That is what is new. Protectionism, in fact, is much older and much more sustained. It doesn't come with Marx. It doesn't come with Keynes. It doesn't come with and you're absolutely right about World War II, in the sense that World War II did change, including nationalization of many assets, Indian Railways included, right? World War I think, is when the Indian Railways nationalization, so that happens, right? But the world does change, there are more tariffs. But the idea of protectionism is much older, is much more sustained, right? And yeah, which goes back to your earlier comment as to why is that somehow more natural, right? I think there's something more natural there's something more natural about the idea of protectionism in terms of how the human brain works.
Yeah, I think it is, yes, it is, might come across as it is obvious on the face of it, but not so obvious also. And again, you go back to interest groups and how their ability to come together and demand privileges and seen unseen, concentrated benefit, dispersed cost, all of that, you start throwing all of that in, and then the outcome will be less surprising probably. Okay, last couple of questions we can take. Anyone? Sandeep or anyone else, if you have a query. Okay. Amit and then Ginny.
Great to meet you again. And I'll ask you a very simple question. They have asked very difficult questions. Yeah, so I just wanted to understand that your one point stuck with me was more population means more ideas and maybe also more innovation. So considering India, there are a lot of more population, but do you see that it is transforming into a better, India as a country transforming into a better, is it in a better place in terms of global trade? Because considering countries like Singapore also, though less population, less people, it still outperforms many developed countries. So what is your...
Well, first of all, just to kind of reiterate the idea, this idea has been around in economics for a while, right? There are, of course, many reasons to trade, right? The first one, of course, is the fact that there is, once there is a comparative advantage, we benefit by specialization and exchange, right? I make the mast, you make the hull, right? And Adam Smith, if you read his Wealth of Nations, just in the first 2 books, so in Wealth of Nations, chapters are divided as books. So if you read book 1, book 2, book 3, that's all you need to read, which is about 25, 30 pages. What's incredible is also you could just read it like modern English. There is no kind of, it doesn't sound strange. And if you read, he gives several reasons why advantages to trade, why people benefit from trade as compared to autarky, right? And one of them, and he doesn't give this ideas reason as explicitly as Michael Kramer did, right? But Smith gives several other reasons. One is also the fact that initially there might be a comparative advantage, which may be small, but as I start doing more of what I do, I just get better and better at it. And as you spend more and more time doing just one thing, you get better and better at it. So our comparative advantages in fact grow, and the benefits from trade grow. Okay, but the idea stuff, really, the one economist who pushed through this wonderfully well was Michael Kramer, again, who got the Nobel Prize some years ago. And Kramer finds if you look at technology in Australia, Tasmania has the worst technology. So if you look at technology for creating fire or hunting or storing goods, Tasmania had the worst technology and Eurasia had the best technology. And he says, how does this happen? There are, of course, many lines of reasoning you can give. But one line of reasoning he gives, and at this point of time, these places were isolated because sea travel was very dangerous, right? And the reason is the fact that, or the postulated reason is the fact that more individuals mean more ideas, and ideas are non-rival. It's not like more apples and also more people who want to eat apples. Now, Singapore is not a small country. Singapore is a very large country. Why? Because people in Singapore can trade with anyone, anywhere in the world. So the geographical boundaries of Singapore is not the economic boundary of Singapore. From an economic boundary point of view, Singapore could be one of the world's largest countries. It's huge. It's much larger than Russia, Canada, United States put together. The economic boundaries of Singapore extend all over the world. You see, it's not the political boundaries you have to look at, it's the economic boundaries, because that's what determines how much division of labor you can do and how you benefit from the ideas of other people. And the other thing is, in terms of benefiting from ideas, and this Michael Kramer doesn't look at, because Kramer is looking at large swatches of time, right? But to benefit from ideas, and especially as ideas grow, you need organization. Organization is key, right? Amit, Kumar, rest of you alone is very different from the organization within which you work. It's a whole different ballgame, which is why human beings work in organizations. Now, creating organizations, right, growing them, changing them, closing them, recreating new ones is key to development of technology and ideas and so on and so forth. Now, just because you have more people, it's not going to translate into new ideas unless you have, an environment in which organizations can thrive, without necessarily being biased about small and medium scale enterprises. What's so nice about medium scale enterprises? Is there anything nice about 4 people being together instead of 40 people? Is there anything nice about the fact that is there any reason to like a firm which has 100 people than 10 firms which has 10 people each? We couldn't care less. The questions we should ask is, what are the goods they produce? What are the costs at which they produce them? Very simple. Right? For some reason, there is this romanticization of the single individual who's plowing somewhere away and producing, right? This is nonsense, right? This must stop. So again, you're right. We have people, but now my own impression is one of the reasons why the American economy has done so well over the last 200 years is within the American economy, they have had relative free trade. So it's a large group of people who've had access to each other and each other's ideas. They've had some amount of trade and free trade with the rest of the world, but within the American economy, it's relatively free trade. Of course, there are think tanks in the US who would want more, a freer environment. That's perfectly fine. But and growth then feeds on itself in the same way that ideas feed on themselves. New ideas create the potential to create still new ideas, right? So again, this is why China could really grow rapidly, because they have lots of people, and if they keep adding more economic flexibility, they could just keep growing rapidly. I think one of the things that the Americans need to wake up to is that the world needs China more than China needs the world at this point of time. They've developed tremendous industrial capacity. And again, today we didn't speak about this. I was in Russia for 10 days at a conference there, right, held by the Bank of Russia. And they have, one of the reasons why the Russian economy is not too damaged by Western sanctions is they've been able to leverage China's production capacities. So they have a large industrial base, and they have a large population who can come up with lots of ideas. You've seen DeepSeek, right? So, but but if they do more in terms of if they create a freer market, it will create this positive loop where new ideas generate still new ideas. I come up with a new idea, then someone far away latches onto that, and still she creates a new idea, and then you latch onto that, right? And this kind of process can really continue for long periods of time, developing growth, right? But again, you need that flexibility. Yeah, that's the key, I think. It wasn't an easy question. By no stretch of imagination.
And anyways, Donald Trump is clubbing India and Russia together, and you traveling to Russia doesn't help. Doesn't help.
I wanted to reopen the discussion that we had with Chetna as to why the world is suddenly closing their economies and adopting protectionist measures. So I have read some interesting ideas about this very thing, and one reason what people quote generally is because contemporarily it has been realized that in the international trade framework there have been some losers of the liberalization of trade, and it was not what was generally realized a few years before. It has been there within a matter of few years, say 4 or 5 years, and that is why countries have started to like become less trustworthy of each other, and they have been entering into free trade agreements with some countries and not others. And also, I mean, regional trade agreements are on the go as well. So in a very broader view, of a bird's eye view of the situation, the world is has suddenly become skeptical of multilateralism and has started entering into plurilateral channels and also closing their economies. So like, what is your take on that? How can we reignite the idea of multilateralism and free trade once again?
I don't have a particular take on that.
Well, my impression is that, the kind of, I think well, first of all, I think it's not quite true that tariffs across the world have grown. Empirically, my impression is, and you can check on this, January next year, right? If you look at the tariff levels around the world and do some weighted average, the tariffs are going to be lower than right now, and lower from previous year, because Trump has pushed some countries to lower tariffs. So there is, of course, the fact that he's put tariffs on things that are coming into.
I'm not talking about Trump's actions per se, but the general trend among countries to close their economies a bit and start focusing on their domestic industries.
Right. So as far as the most recent phenomenon is concerned, I think it's not very clear. There is some change, of course. Is the American economy is more difficult to import into, but I think many other economies it's become easier to send goods to, right? So it's not, my impression is that tariff levels may have gone down. So Trump may have actually promoted international trade in some senses by pushing these companies. But your point is valid. Again, this is a very, very difficult question. Now, I think there are very good reasons, and again, this is somewhere where I think it's an issue that libertarians don't really look into, but economists do. As you know, I'm very sympathetic to, I've been with libertarians, I've benefited from their company, and I enjoy the conversations. But for all my liking for free trade, there are reasons to be concerned with developing certain amount of domestic industry. At Western, I was in Russia. As you enter Russia, you cannot use Visa, you cannot use MasterCard to make payments. Right? Suddenly, these companies have decided that we are not going to, cooperate with the Russian economy. And all this while, you were like free trade, specialization and exchange, all of this is wonderful. And suddenly, these companies are now acting as if, they're acting on behest of certain states or obeying certain states. In fact, I do not know if you know about what Microsoft has done to Nyara. Nyara, and I don't know if I pronounce this correctly, does Nyara sell petrol in Delhi? Okay, so Nyara is, so Nyara doesn't exist in Delhi. Okay. Nyara is a company which is 49% Russian held and 51% held by some Indian cooperative. Okay, and they essentially do is they buy gas and oil from Russia, refine it, and sell part of it back to Europe. Europeans are happy to buy this. Okay, right, and they sell that stuff in India too. So in Kerala, for instance, there are Nyara petrol pumps. Right, Nyara had paid Microsoft money, right, for provision of data services and blah blah blah. Microsoft has recently refused to continue providing that service, and Nyara has now gone to court, right, in response not American sanctions but European sanctions. And Nyara now says that Microsoft is being activist because Because they're an American company, they don't have to respond to these European sanctions. Now, this is a bit strange. Now, companies start looking a little, especially larger companies, start looking like quasi-state actors. So, our model of thinking about this kind of free trade, profit maximizing cooperation, which has nothing to do with governments being very different from corporations. Again, we began with Buchanan, right? And my supervisor, who's a student of Buchanan, Dick Wagner, has a book called Entangled Political Economy. Right? Companies and larger corporations, and I think Marxists kind of do somewhat of a good job in terms of their basic approach here. When we think of very large corporations, we cannot think of them as devoid of the functioning of the state. They have something to do with the state. So we need a richer model of thinking about market competition. And what Microsoft has just done, unless we have domestic capacity in India to substitute for what Microsoft has done, we are in trouble. And this is what the Russians have realized. So they've now tried to develop a fair amount of domestic capacity, even where the cost of domestic production is higher, because of division of labor exposes you to this situation. Now, you're absolutely right. In a multilateral world, where there are multilateral agencies through which you need to take through decisions, these things, it's much safer to rely on others, so to say, right? And the people who killed, in some senses, multilateralism is, in my memory, is the Bush administration going to the Iraq War. Right? The Iraq War, was criticized by the French. It's not very clear the Italians wanted to go in. Most other countries did not want to go in. Nobody thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It was not sanctioned by and Bush decided to go in. And if a state which is sort of in some sense leading the world keeps kind of making multilateral organizations irrelevant, of course things are going to break down till a new state takes over and creates these multilateral organizations. Right? So I think you're absolutely right, and I think we need a richer model of understanding trade, international relations, effect of sanctions, and things of the sort. Of course, we need to understand basic advantages of trading. That's what most of our conversation has been about. But we need to kind of understand, multilateralism. We need to understand how companies interact with states and what do you do in case of sanctions. Now, for instance, Trump says that if the Indian economy, buys oil from Russians, he's going to do this or that. In fact, today I read in the press, I don't know if this is true, that 2 government-held Indian oil manufacturers have reduced buying Russian oil on the spot market. Nyara and Reliance possibly will continue to hold their contracts, but 2 government-held companies are not buying from the spot market. Not very clear why we should do that. The Russian oil is much cheaper. Cannot be blackmailed, cannot be bullied. We will not, right? And again, this goes back to the earlier arguments I made. If you're a small country which is hurting itself through really silly policies, you cannot stand up to the bully. We need our markets to be free. We need to be prosperous ourselves to be able to stand up to the bully. We need to do more with the Russians, much more, right? If Trump doesn't like it, be it, right? So, but again, you cannot do that if you are an economy which pursues policies that hurts itself, right? Only if you are a growing, prosperous country can we do that. And India is in a peculiar strategic, peculiar global situation. The Russians leaned on the Chinese when the Western sanctions came in, right? And the Chinese economy is very large. Now, India cannot do that with the Chinese because of the border disputes. So you have nothing left. If the Americans don't like you and you have border disputes with the Chinese, you're in a very peculiar scenario. So really, this is high time that Indians look at what's happening inside and we start doing the big economic reforms we need on the inside to get our economy going. We don't have much of a choice. This is, the issues we face are much more dire than the particular Trump tariffs that appear at the moment.
Manufacture and environmental protection as well. I don't know if you might be aware of the EU's incoming policy of CBAM, that is carbon border tax adjustment. So in that, in plurilateral and multilateral sense only, I think free trade led to the establishment of many industries in smaller economies and hurting their state of environment at that time. And then the EU is now leaving tax to adjust the carbon leakage. So I think this raises a lot more debate and questioning on the multilateral framework itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. These are very intertwined issues.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts on this. One, until recently, at least, Steven Pinker and Johann Norberg have books on this, where they say historically you know, the trend always has been, more free trade, overall, and rather than the other way. Last few years are an aberration, and I don't know where we will end up, especially after COVID years, when people started to look more inwards. There was no trade happening, especially international trade was happening, but everything shut down. And of course the geopolitics. Now, and the smaller point about the wars, by the Bush era. Uh, and this is what is most fascinating about ideas in general, that how at the root of it all is ideas, and you realize the ability of United States, or in particular, for them to wage a perpetual war forever, and continue into this ability, has a lot to do with their monetary policy, in this case going away from. So if you can print, and there is no stoppage at the end, at what time you have to stop, you can be in a war and you can do whatever you want forever. And that is what many of the policies are internationally, what you see, what is happening, or the uncertainties and geopolitical upheaval you are seeing. The root of it all, probably I would say, lies in the easy money policy at some point of time, where the cost, there is no stoppage at which. So in earlier times, when a country used to go into a war with someone else, you'd see you run out of money, you run out, the war stops. Now you don't run out of money, and the war never stops. So, and therefore all the other things kind of happen, including countries start to look inwards, and these are all also tools. So for example, my ability, okay, I am going to control the semiconductors and essential earth minerals. I'm in China, and I'm in Taiwan, and I'm somewhere else. All of this, are essentially tools of continuing that warfare in other measures. So you stop that, and its ripple effects will be somewhere else. So it's much more dynamic, complex, interesting, evolving world, probably that way. I like वहाँ पे the Leland Yeager has International Monetary Relations as a book. Yeager, this is what you will find in CCS. So ideas will be all around you. We'll just we are above time. We'll just take one last question from Amit. Okay, one. Okay, Sandeep and then Amit, please. Yeah, Sandeep, go ahead.
India and US on tariff can bring together India and China on a single platform, as per your opinion? Is there any chance?
I mean, the Indo-US tariff issue is a relatively minor passing issue compared to the India-China issue. Those issues are much deeper. They involve disputes over territory, which states tend to kind of be very sensitive about. There is much larger infrastructure that the Chinese state is building in and around the Indian state in many ways, and has been for many years. All the way from, I do not know if you know, but Bangladesh has nuclear ambitions, right? There are presently nuclear reactors under construction in Bangladesh. The issue between India and China is far, far deeper. It's, some minor passing small dispute between kind of one American president who's going to last, whose term is going to be another 3 years, 4 years. Those things don't kind of tilt the balance permanently the other way. The Indian state has got to accept the reality that it would be neighboring the world's largest, potentially one of the most, potentially second most advanced, technologically advanced economy for the next 100 or 200 years. And that's just a reality that the Indian state and Indian population have got to kind of accept and see what needs to be done from there. It's not very clear conflict is the way to go, simply because you cannot win. But certainly you can put up enough resistance and be potential partners. But it's and it's not. Again, it's important not to exaggerate the Trump story as an American story. The American economy is a wonderfully productive economy, right? Lots of Indians go to the United States, benefit, stay there, come back. We have deep relations with the American, polity, society in many ways. And and one must see the Trump story, I think, as a passing phenomena and not overreact too much. But again, your question is not simple at all. is perhaps the most difficult of the lot.
Wow. Okay, final question, Amit.
Just simple points and one question. Um I think the day we started talking about this tariff thing, and keep India aside, when there was a debate about US and China, and basically what I, in my imagination, could picture, it's like, if you think from the consumer perspective, actually the US president, you can cartoonize it, like was slapping its own citizens, and he says, I slap you once, and Chinese president or premier says, I slap my citizens twice, and then the competition continues. And after a while, it is actually, at the end, these are the consumers or citizens who are beaten up while these guys are fighting. So the key thing happens to be, how do we present and communicate this, that we should not be thinking from the producer's point of view, we should be thinking from the consumer point of view. And because now these bilateral and multilateral trade is not no more just a trade, it's a part of your geopolitical game. And possibly that is where I see, though the US president might be a disaster, but in some sense, he is also pushing the reform agenda in India. Uh, and therefore, possibly we realize that, you cannot depend upon US, China, Russia, or whoever, because this world is moving fast and moving in multiple different directions with a lot of uncertainty. So the only way could be is pull up your socks, set up your house in order. And that is where I also see that there is some movement in Indian government also, thinking in terms of deregulation commission, or thinking about, how do we ease the business, and therefore. And I think the other good thing is that now, at least in marketing or PR or for whatever reason, there is some sort of ambition, the ambition of X trillion dollar economy. And because you are thinking about that, then you will have to put your house in order to be capable. And therefore, you can go to these, international platforms and negotiate and all of that. So, one is, what is your opinion on that? Second is, something that you briefly touched is how part of it, because how part of it, how to introduce, or how do you we communicate to consumer or citizen or voters at large that this is in your benefit. For an example, this agri reforms completely miscommunicated, failed, and this is in some sense opportunity which has been kind of pushed for another decade. I don't think any political party can now venture into this for at least for some good period of time. While you're talking about it, and you talked about NISA, and we see whether NISA is actually a consumer or a producer. It is basically a producer because these are low cost private schools. But if we see in terms of regulation, who are the producers of regulation and who are the consumer of regulation? So in this case, the school, we call them edupreneurs. They are in some sense the consumer of regulation, or let's call victim of regulations, and then they can organize. We also tried doing it as a parents forum. Can we organize parents? Similar to your idea of your rice and wheat consumers. But we see there are none. And we also by and large failed in our attempt of creating it because of, you would better understand public choice theory, etc. Yet, do you see some hope? It was not possible. It has not been possible in history because of many other things. But now, are we at some point where communication is easy? We can directly reach out to millions of people together, and then can create a movement or something like that. And third is, I would love if you touch a little bit on dairy products also. We talked quite a bit on agri, and specifically on dairy product, what I'm hearing is there is some negotiation is happening because they feed something to their cows, etc., which Indian government is unwilling to accept it. I mean, and I was thinking, why not just simply label it? Like, smoking causes harm. Still, if you want to smoke it, that's your choice. So these three different points. One was comment, second your perspective, and third is if you have some knowledge about dairy product.
May I actually take your last question first? So, and the reason is perhaps, again, these are quite involved things. But the last question has a little bit of a funny story that I wish to tell, which is why I want to take it up first. So, before the funny story, if you go to the American government's trade website, okay, it gives list of tariffs and trades in different tariffs in different countries and so on. Not just now; it's been around for years and years, right? And when you go to the India page, one of the things it explicitly mentions, I don't know if it still does, when I looked up a few years ago, is non-tariff barriers coming into India, right? And this thing that you read in the press, I doubt whether things that they're feeding the cows in Europe, right, which given European standards, the Europeans find is perfectly okay for their population, that the Indian government has still higher standards for its population. I would be very surprised. This is probably just another attempt to create a non-tariff barrier. Delhi probably, again, I'm just kind of conjecturing. They probably hired some whiz kid and said, hey, can you find like something that I can negotiate with these guys with? And the whiz kid probably said, what about this chemical? It does something or something of the sort, right? But the funny story is that, and there are two dogs I have. One of them I've had since I was a student in the US. His name is Mowgli, and I was getting Mowgli from the US, and I got him here. I had to get lots of paperwork done, right? I get all this paperwork done. I come here, which is like, he's got all the right vaccines, etc., etc. And of course, India is a high rabies area. So really, my dog should be afraid of coming to India, right? Not India because US is a extremely low rabies area, right? But nonetheless, I got all the paperwork done, and he's the hilarious part, Amit. So I come in, and you get out of the airport, and then there is a rule that after you exit the airport, within 3 days, you have to present your animal, dog, cat, whatever, to a government veterinary office in that same city. And there are only some airports you can bring animals into. So I got through Bombay airport. I stayed in Bombay for, you were in Bombay then, yeah, 3 days. And then I went to the government veterinary thing.
Because of this, you had to
Yes. Well, that wasn't too bad, apart from...
He told me he was there to meet me.
multiple, as Amit said, things evolving in multiple directions, right? So now I go to this building. Now in this building I go in, and and it's a dilapidated government building, but the government employees there are very polite, very nice people. The government veterinary doctor comes in and he inspects my dog, and he's signing this paper that everything is okay. No bribe, nothing, very clean. Right? But the funny part is, as he's saying my dog is okay and he doesn't have this thing, and he looks at the US papers and he says these US papers are okay, etc., etc. There are stray dogs outside with all kinds of illnesses. What are you doing? The sanitation standards are so low that even if you let dogs come from the United States or Europe without any certification, the chance of them doing any damage here is extremely low. This is just the kind of burden and barriers that Indian government builds up for no rational reason whatsoever. So I doubt, and your idea of labeling is perfectly sensible, but I doubt whether any of this has to do with the science of what this chemical does to the body. It's probably another non-tariff barrier that the Indian government is trying to bring in to protect the dairy industry, and of course not the consumers of dairy, right? So all of which brings me to kind of another thing, like going back to your question about second question about how to create, how to change it. It's very kind of, Kumar said, if you do this, you get a Nobel Prize. And then I said, you will probably win in an election if you do this and things like this. Also, this is an uncracked thing. I like this phrase that revolution begins from the dictionary. So what if we start, instead of using protecting the dairy industry, we always start using, this is government policy to hurt dairy consumers. Right? Protection is something good. We all like to be protected. Right? I don't know, you like to say, I feel very protected, I feel very safe here. And you can ask some of your, employees here, they'd say, I like coming to CCS, I feel safe, I feel comfortable, I feel, when, relationships, families, and so on, we like to feel protected. So I think, if we can get rid of some of these words, which is something we can try to do ourselves without necessarily having to build a large group of people to come together. Nonetheless, of course, this is very challenging. And I think, of course, one way to try to resolve this issue is just to try to invest more in terms of thinking about this. Right? How do we resolve this issue? And running various experiments, not just thinking and not doing anything, but running various experiments, like the stuff you did with school. What is the smallest group that you can create? What is the, who are the people what are the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the group that you can create? It's not very clear to me. I think one person who kind of has some insights on this, I think of course you, because you've been running this place, and the person who ran this place some years before you, Parth, right? But I think people like you, people like Parth, you need to come together and run small experiments. I think it's not a question of writing academic papers. I think we can learn a lot by trying to run small experiments of creating these groups and see which ones work, click, because at different points of time in history, different places, it will have to be different groups that will click. That said, I have a last thing to say. I think one fundamental mistake that libertarians, well, not all libertarians, but of the Center for Civil Society kind, is they're also Democrats in some senses. They like democracy. They think that convincing the masses and keeping everybody together is very important. It's not very clear to me that's very important, right? I think when you look at major changes in human history, at times it's the elites who drive it. At times it's the masses, right? So for instance, you do have this revolution in Romania or wherever, or or in Poland, where people come together and they throw out a dictator, right? And most people believe that this guy is not good for us, we don't want to live in such a system. That does happen. But there are other times in history where it's an elite that just drives a change. And if you can convince the elite, you can move things, right? And the earlier example you gave of the agricultural bill, as long as you convince a small elite to have the bill, and as long as you tell the elite that here is some steps you need to do to make sure that there is no repeat of the fiasco that happened last time, right? It's not very clear to me that you need to go to the masses. So again, sometimes when we think about educational programs, who should we do it for? Should we do it for students somewhere in far off regions? Kumar wanted to go to Bihar and do stuff in Bihar, which is wonderful. But should we just do it with the elite students of St. Stephen's College in Delhi? Because we know that they are the ones who are going to make decisions. Maybe that's where we should focus our resources, just have all the elites on our side. This is a very different approach to kind of thinking from the more democratic approach that you have. But I wonder if there is some merit to kind of, and I'd like to hear what you kind of think about.
This is a great idea. This is also one of the ways of thinking. But also in our experience, elites actually like regulation.
Yeah.
They are the one who can control things.
Yeah.
They become restricting the market only for themselves.
Yeah.
So that's the problem.
But Sauvik, for instance, used to say that the British civil servants, for some eras, and again going back to the pre-World War I era, certainly pre-World War II era, right? She was absolutely right in pointing out those kind of junctures in history where things change. Some of their training to become a civil servant involved, reading Adam Smith, and so there is a way to train the elites. There is a way to train the prince, right? So can we identify the next prince and train the prince to believe in some of these ideas? That would kind of, are we spreading ourselves too thin? Amit, I think we should go to Argentina. I think people like you should send someone to Argentina, right? We should go and try to meet members of his team, figure out exactly what they did and exactly what's the sequence of events. How did they win? It's not easy for them. Already Pinochet, he pushed markets, and Pinochet did a great deal of damage to civilian population in terms of violation of his basic kind of human rights, right? So when you come in, it's easy for the opposition to attack you, that to try to conflate two things, that markets mean violation of human rights. So opposition would have done this. They did do this. So to beat all of that and to win an election, so we need to go. We need to get the details, specifics of what strategies were followed. I think that's that kind of work. I think again, it wouldn't get a Nobel Prize or any mention, but I think it has tremendous potential benefits. So, of course, if you're sending someone to Argentina, I'm happy to go. Just let me know. So, and Amit, I do want to thank you for this opportunity. I'm delighted. I want to thank Kumar as well for this opportunity. But Amit, thank you so much for having me at Center for Civil Society. And I began by saying it feels, I do come back. It feels like coming back home, right? So, yeah.
Always happy to welcome you.
Yeah.
We don't need to thank.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Still pushing him to create taxpayers.
Yeah. There are taxpayer alliances, I know, organization, but again, it's a small group of people, does not constitute everyone who pays taxes, unfortunately. Before we conclude and thank Vipin, one small point. To answer earlier Ginny's question about ideas, generally, and how it kind of happens in places which is very populated. Vipin is in the business of creating ideas, probably, as part of an academic, writing research papers, etc., and has purposefully chosen to stay in a place which is not very populated, So hopefully you'll come to Delhi often, if for nothing else, then for how kind of ideas germinate, with more people around rather than
I think Delhi has wonderful people. It's a fabulous place.
Just kidding. So
no, I'm happy to come more often. More often. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your patience, everyone, and for engaging with questions. You talked about people feeling comfortable. I could see Shavi was very, very comfortable. So thank you very much, and back to snacks. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.